Hey, 11th grade. Happy Wednesday. Hope your first 2 days of online learning are going great. If they're not, let me know, and we can talk about that because I hope you're having a decent time doing the stuff for me. And speaking of which, I did not receive everything from everybody for Monday, so just make sure that you do get that to me by tonight, by midnight. And then I won't count it late because I know we're all getting used to this. And some of you guys may simply just forgotten to share the document with me. But just know that that reading card document, you're going to be using that for the rest of Harry Potter until we get done with all of that. And so you'll just continue to add onto that so you don't have to share it with me again. Just once you've shared it with me once, I can go in and see when you've actually completed the work and so on and so forth. So if you haven't turned that in yet, or you haven't shared that with me yet, go ahead and do that after you finish everything for today. And then I will not count it late against you for this first couple of days. But then after tonight at midnight, I'm going to start counting things late, and you don't want to load yourself up on zeros while we are doing all of this online learning stuff. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into what we've got going on for today. So let me go ahead and fix this up real quick. I think we're going here. Yes. There we are. All right. So here's what you got going on today. So you did that yesterday, and then today you are to read chapters 9 and 10. So if you've already done that, congratulations. Glad you read those two chapters. There's a lot of stuff going on there. And then you are watching this video, which I will upload when this is done. And then afterwards, you'll have your reading card, and then you will take the quiz on chapters 7 through 10 and continue to work on your essay. All right, so let's move on to Potter. All right, so guys, please know right here at the beginning that, as you've probably already seen by the timestamp on this video, it's going to be rather long. I can only assume how long it's going to be. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump into things. But before I do that, I just want you all to know that as we continue going on through this, it's not every day that an English teacher gets to teach one of his favorite books, if not one of his top 5 favorite books of all time. And although it's not my favorite book in the entire series as a book in and of itself, it is one of my favorites, if that makes sense. And so I'll probably talk a lot, and just bear with me because there's some good stuff in here, and there's some really good craft and structure on Rowling's part, and just some incredible world building techniques that are happening throughout this. So we're just going to dive in, and then if you guys have any questions after the fact, just let me know. Send me an email if you didn't understand something. But of course, you don't understand something, you have the ability to watch this on YouTube, and you can just hit pause and back it up just a little bit and get what you missed. And I will also make these slides available to you after I finish this video. All right, so let's jump into this. All right, so we have talked about the universal theme of children's literature a little bit that day right before we were waiting on the books to come in, and I went on that long history lecture and like basically timeline lecture of children's literature. And through that, I told you all that the universal theme of children's literature, or the big idea that unites most children's lit, it's actually 2 things. One, you have the lost child. And I've placed it in quotation marks because it isn't a child in the sense that's lost geographically, that can't find his way back home or her way back home. It's more of that it's a discovery of themselves. They're lost in a sense because they don't know who they are, or there's something from their life that's missing. And so they have to go off on some kind of whirlwind, crazy adventure. And then through that, they end up growing and coming to appreciate something that they didn't appreciate before, or come to understand something about themselves that they didn't actually know. Now, of course, the other thing that plays into this, that also plays into this universal theme, and is probably a separate theme in and of itself, is that of growing up. But as I just said, from the lost child going from someplace and moving into somewhere else, that's a part of that. And so they're really interconnected. And honestly, I would say that the universal theme as a whole isn't the lost child or growing up, but it's the lost child's journey of growing up. And putting that all together to have that. And of course, with our, trademark children's literature characters that, that we can point to as basic main principal characters within the canon of children's lit. We first have Alice from Alice in Wonderland. And of course, she's a lost child because she's lost in Wonderland. But as I have made you all aware, and as you will be made aware when we finally do read Alice in Wonderland at the end of the semester, Alice's growth comes from her learning to understand how the world works. And I don't want to give too much of that away before we get there, but that's a part of her, discovery back into her own self and discovering who she is. And she grows up because of that and is able to escape Wonderland as a result. Then you also have characters like Dorothy Gale, also from Children's Lit, from The Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum, who is actually lost and is just trying to find her way back home. But as you guys probably know from the movie, that when she does get back home, well, in the beginning of the movie, all she wants to do is escape. And she just wants to go somewhere else. She wants to go somewhere over the rainbow where, she can live her life the way she wants to. And she doesn't have to worry about people like Mrs. Gulch and, Auntie M telling her how to live her life and, Gulch taking away Toto and, having all these other issues that she has to deal with that she just doesn't want to deal with. But it's rather interesting because the first time she gets into Oz and once she realizes where she is, the first thing she wants is to find a way back home, the very place that she didn't want to be right at the beginning. It's only when she's thrown into somewhere else and she's like, no, this is all wrong. I really know what I want. I want to go back home. Which is interesting because she doesn't have to go on the journey. She just needs to not be lost. But it's through that whole process of the journey that she does come to appreciate her home more, even though she wants to get back the entire time. And of course, we also see this whole idea of the lost child and growing up completely through Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I mean, in chapter 1, Professor McGonagall even says to Dumbledore as they're dropping Harry off at number 4 Privet Drive, really, Dumbledore, you think you can explain all this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in our world will know his name. And then, of course, Dumbledore says something to the extent of, that's exactly why he cannot do it. That would be far too much for a boy to grow up in, and he'd never even understand who he was. And so Dumbledore, in his infinite wisdom, proves to McGonagall that we have to drop Harry off at his family. I mean, this is the only family he has, even if they are muggles who, despise us and who aren't really going to have anything to do with us. Well, this is better for Harry because he'll be protected. And if it's 11 years of, sorrow and strife, that's what it has to be to protect him from the fame and the glory. And he'll be able to deal with that at a much better time. And of course, this means that Harry's going to be lost for the first 11 years of his life. The first 11 years of his life, because he turned 11 in that next chapter. And so because of that, Harry does grow up lost. He doesn't know who he is. He wants to know who he is. And that, as I pointed out before we left for break, the biggest thing is that even at the end of one of the chapters, Harry is just wishing for some kind of relative like him to come and rescue him. He's lost. He doesn't understand who he is. And so it takes, a journey. Hagrid showing up and him going off on books to grab books in Diagon Alley, being thrown into the world to finally arrive at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. And, on the train, he meets Ron and they start their friendship. And, he also meets Hermione and doesn't really care too much for her yet. But it's rather interesting that in this whole idea of Harry being lost and not understanding who he is, that the very first thing to happen at Hogwarts is the sorting ceremony, where it's going to define who he is as a person. And maybe that'll add something to this idea of being lost, because now he'll be given an opportunity to explore who he is with people who are like him. And so, of course, the 4 houses, as said by the Sorting Hat. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. Their daring nerve and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. You might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. Or yet in wise old Ravenclaw, if you've a ready mind, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Or perhaps in Slytherin you'll make your real friends. Those cunning folks use any means to achieve their ends. Pretty bold statements all across the board, and pretty strong characteristics all across the board as well. These aren't just simple, this isn't just a simple personality test. These are like very strong traits of chivalry, just, wit, cunning. Those aren't exactly qualities that we just associate with people on the go. It's very rare to hear someone be called, chivalrous, or hear someone be called just, or wit's a little bit more common, but to have a ready mind, that's not something you hear every so often. And also, like, cunning folks using any means to achieve their ends. Now that one's a bit more, of a punch to the gut. It feels like the way that one's written, because there's more focus there. But these things aren't everyday qualities. These are deeply embedded qualities that, basically describe your entire personality and who you are, and it's how you react in situations. It's very situationally based, but it's also very, based upon how you treat other people. And to JK, that's really interesting that that's how she determined her own test, and how she put those own qualities in there. But going back to Harry, this is the first thing that happens, this definition of character. Maybe Harry's found a good spot, but immediately we go in to the book, and we find that in chapter 7 that Harry's first objective assessment of his character occurs right here. Sorting Hat says difficult, very difficult. Plenty of courage, I see. Not a bad mind either. There's talent. Oh my goodness, yes. And a nice thirst to prove yourself. Now that's interesting. And so Harry's always been told by his family, by the Dursleys, he's not worth anything. And then he meets Hagrid, and Hagrid's like, no, you're worth everything. But Harry doesn't really know what to make of any of this, but with the authority of the hat embedded and endowed with the, the own minds of Godric Gryffindor and Salazar Slytherin and Helga Hufflepuff and Rowena Ravenclaw, this is a very objective statement of his character. It's magic. It can be trusted. It's something that's very objective and very straightforward. And because of that, Harry can believe in what is being said about him. But he makes a very bold choice here, because as the hat is, looking into his soul and looking into his mind and his character, Harry's just thinking, not Slytherin, not Slytherin. And the hat says, not Slytherin, hey, are you sure? Well, you could be great, It's all here in your head, and Slytherin will help you on your way to greatness, no doubt about that. No. Well, if you're sure, better be Gryffindor. Harry heard the hat shout the last word to the whole hall. He took off the hat and walked shakily toward the Gryffindor table. He was so relieved to have been chosen and not put in Slytherin. He hardly noticed that he was getting the loudest cheer yet. So Harry has finally discovered who he is. He knows that being courageous, being brave, well, that's something that he can, stake a claim to. Like, I am this. I know I'm this. That's awesome. Like, he has something to live for now. He has some objective assessment of his character, which is awesome. And then people love him. He's with them, and that's great. And they're really welcoming towards him. Well, yeah, he's famous, okay, and they just got the new celebrity, so they're probably cheering about that. But Harry doesn't realize that because he's not conscious of his own fame. He doesn't know it. So to Harry, it's like, this is my new family. From immediately. Hogwarts is or Gryffindor House in Hogwarts is immediately made his new family. And it's a beautiful thing that happens right there. So the choice that he makes here is ultimately a choice between good and evil. At least in Harry's mind, the choice between Gryffindor or Slytherin is ultimately a choice between good and evil. Now, it's really interesting because the hat says that he could be great, and Slytherin will help you on your way to greatness. But to Harry, Slytherin is already associated with bad people because of Draco Malfoy, knowing that he would be put in Slytherin because that's just where he belongs. And so it's interesting that in Harry's mind, Gryffindor equals good and Slytherin equals evil. But from Of course, because the novel is narrated from Harry's perspective and that third person limited viewpoint, the reader associates Slytherin with evil. Severus Snape is the head of Slytherin House, and Snape never has a good light shown on him at this point in the book. There's a lot of mysteriousness and intrigue about Severus Snape, and he is seen as the initial villain in the entire thing. And that's rather interesting because since Harry sees it this way, and as Rowling suggests it this way, not even through Rowling's suggestion, but through Harry's own suggestion, we naturally associate Slytherin with evil. But I will go ahead and say right now, not all Slytherins are bad. Horace Slughorn, who, if you all, know the story, was a Slytherin. And he's a jolly old guy who's just like a Santa Claus type figure without the beard. He's jolly. He jokes around. I mean, he's got some darkness to him as well, but it's just because he messed up. But that's another story for book 6 and 7. So anyway, continuing on. Oh, also there's the discussion of just kidding. Okay. Also, there's the discussion of as they're sitting at the table, there's a discussion between everyone's families and where they come from. And this begins to bring up the issues and the rather complex issues of pure-blood wizards, half-blood wizards, and muggle-born wizards. Now, a pure-blood wizard is a wizard who comes from a family whose ancestors were both wizards, and every marriage after that included a wizard-to-wizard marriage. Now, a half-blood wizard is a little bit different from that because half-blood wizards mean that one wizard of the couple one half of the couple was a wizard, a pure-blood wizard, and the other wizard was a muggle. And through that unity, they created a, half-blood child who has both muggle blood and pure-blood wizard blood. And then, of course, there's also the random chance of a muggle-born wizard who has both parents are muggles, and somehow the child shows magical capability and somehow, is strong enough of a person to have magical abilities. Think of it as kind of like a force kind of thing from Star Wars. That's probably a poor example, but somehow, and I don't remember the exact reason why it happens, but two muggles can actually have a child that has magical powers or has aptitude for magical powers. But it's really interesting because these divisions are typically known as pure blood are the elitists. They're the height of society. Half bloods are not seen as the best kind of wizards, and the muggleborns are the worst. And there's even a derogatory term for them called mudblood, which is what Malfoy calls Hermione at one point in the book because she's a muggle-born wizard. But it's really interesting because you have the pure blood families like the Malfoy family, who step on top of everyone and think they're the best thing in the world. And then you have the half-blood wizards who are more in number than the pure blood wizards. And then you have the muggle-born wizards who are very different. But what's really interesting is that the Weasleys are also a pure blood family, but they don't act like the Malfoys. And that's a really interesting distinction that J.K. very subtly puts into place here at the beginning. And of course, that'll become more important and apparent as the series goes on, as this one just introduces a lot of things. But it's really interesting that these lines are drawn as the kids are all discussing who their parents are. My mom was a wizard, but my dad's a muggle, and that was a pretty nasty secret when that got out. Is they had a big fight about that. I think is what Seamus Finnegan says as he's explaining everything, that one of the parents didn't know that the other one was a wizard until they started talking about having children. Not a conversation you want to have like that. But yes, so these are really interesting ideas that show up, and they have greater significance later on. But I thought that they were important just to find some of Rowling's own vocabulary as we continue on with this. It's also interesting that in the Sorting Hats thing, I think I may have duplicated a slide unintentionally, but as the Sorting Hat says all this to Harry, as you can obviously tell, he mentions that Harry has the qualities of every single house, but his courage and his thirst to prove himself are the strongest, and that's why it is torn between the decisions. it has to mate between Gryffindor and Slytherin. But of course, the hat knows where it's supposed to go. But Harry's an interesting case, and so it takes Harry's own opinion into the mix. All right, then we move on to Chapter 8, The Potions Master, which is, of course, in reference to Severus Snape, the head of Slytherin House and the potions teacher. Now, this is for you all who have read all of the books or have seen all of the movies. So I am going to, when I make these slides available to you, this is something that you can look into yourself. I'm not going to go into it right now, but one of the most interesting things, or at least for those of you that don't know, this just goes along with Rowling's whole craft and structure and how she had this whole thing planned out to the, most ridiculous degree. And it's just why she's one of the best, if not the best, children's author there is. So Snape says, Potter. This is the first thing he says to him. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? Now in book 6, we know what these two things make. I won't go into that, but it's revealed in the potions class what these two ingredients actually make. It's a very advanced spell, or it's a very advanced potion that can create some interesting stuff. I won't go into that right now, but this article is from Wizarding World. It's a link right here, so when you guys have access to these slides, you can click on that if you are interested. If you have not read or seen the movies, do not click on that, as major spoilers will follow. Also within this chapter, we find when Harry breaks out of the common room to go off on his, let me just take that away, to go off on his wizard duel to meet Malfoy near the trophy room at midnight, that he accidentally, along with Ron and Hermione and somehow Neville, actually stumble upon the Forbidden Room that Dumbledore said was off limits to all students at the start of term feast. And so Harry begins to take on this really interesting sleuthing role into the mystery of the connection between the Gringotts thing with the vault that Hagrid and him went to when he went to Diagon Alley with him, and then tying all of these pieces together and where they all go with the major, mystery of the novel. But it's really interesting that the first clue to all of this is found by breaking a school rule. And so Harry, rather unintentionally, breaks a rule to find knowledge. Now that echoes a rather interesting theme from the oldest story on record that we have. I wonder where that theme comes from, and probably in Genesis 3, maybe? I don't know. Not saying it's a good thing by any means. I'm not a heretic, but you see the parallels in how we tell the same stories over and over and over again. We just, embellish them and make things more interesting sometimes. So it's rather even more interesting in flying lessons with Madam Hooch. Harry's rule breaking even rewards him a spot on the Gryffindor Quidditch team, which also breaks a rule. Because when Harry ends up flying after Malfoy to gather Neville, to retrieve Neville's Remembrall that he had just received, he breaks a rule. He's not supposed to be on his broomstick while Madam Hooch was taking Neville to the infirmary. But McGonagall sees this, and this even rewards him with a spot on the Gryffindor Quidditch team, which in and of itself breaks another rule about first years not being able to be on their house teams. A little rule breaking may be a good thing, and this is one of the most complex moral issues at the heart of the novel. Is it okay to break rules if it's the right thing to do? It's the most Gryffindor thing to do, that's for sure. But this idea, this is one of the most major themes of the entire novel itself. It's really interesting how this will continue to play out, and for those of you that know the story, you know where it will eventually go with that idea. But it's interesting that it's introduced here. All right, then we moved into the final chapter that you guys had to read for today, which is Chapter 10, Halloween. Now, of course, at a School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Halloween is going to be the biggest blowout of the year. This is their Christmas. And so it's really interesting because Rowling continues to build the world as life is in full swing at Hogwarts. There's all kinds of things that are happening. The kids are going to classes. There's other things that are happening. Harry slowly settles into a routine at Hogwarts and begins to really love the place that he has now found himself in his new home and with his new family. And there's all kinds of little things that happen. There's a Nimbus 2000 broomstick gifted to him from McGonagall. There's Quidditch, the entire explanation of Quidditch. Rowling created an entire sport for this world, in a world where she had already created an economy and a class system and an own history with these weird bloodlines that are created, and the whole society in Diagon Alley, and the whole world that Harry's being introduced to, and we have our major villain and we have our major hero, and there's mystery and there's intrigue and there's all this kind of stuff, and there's even their own sport. She thought about everything, literally thought about everything she possibly could to build this world, and that's what makes it so great. Also, we get to see another class in the infamous Wingardium Leviosa scene, in which, you know, they finally get to learn to make their little feathers levitate in the air. But of course, as it is, you know, Hermione is the only one that's able to do it correctly, and at Ron's unfortunate displeasure, he is paired with Hermione, and then, you know, he receives quite a bad telling off, or at least an intellectual telling off from Hermione when she tells him that it's Wingardium Leviosa, not Wingardium Leviosa, as, you know, Ron continues to mispronounce the chant when he even gets the swish and flick wrong. And then so Ron, at the end of class, or as they're leaving class, says, "It's no wonder no one can stand her. She's a nightmare, honestly." And of course, Hermione hears this, and she's rather upset by that, and so she ends up crying, which Harry notices and runs off to the girls' bathroom nearby. Now, of course, through all of this, as the night continues to get to the Halloween feast, Hermione is nowhere to be found, and at one point, randomly, Professor Quirrell, the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, runs into the Great Hall and says, "There's a troll in the dungeons. Thought you should know." And then he passes out. And then so Dumbledore has to fire off a couple of firecracker sounds from his wand to calm everybody down. And then he tells all the prefects to take their houses back to their common rooms, and so that they will be safe from the harm of the troll. But as that's happening, of course, Ron and Harry realizes that Hermione doesn't know about the troll because she's probably still in the bathroom, since, you know, dinner probably happened shortly after class. And they decide that they need to go get her and make sure that she's safe. Now, through this, their house characteristics of bravery and chivalry shine because they go to protect her. And it's not chivalry because she's a girl and they're the big, strong men. It's chivalry and friendship, or it's chivalry and caring for your fellow people and caring for your fellow family, even if they don't necessarily like her. And so through that event of them taking down the troll, which is pretty awesome. I mean, they use the one charm they've learned, but they end up doing it. And Harry ends up making it happen through a little blunt force of sticking his wand up the troll's nose. Not the most conventional method, but hey, it works. Just, you know, clean the troll snot off of his wand and everything. But their house characteristics shine through all of this. Hermione's included, because once Professor McGonagall shows up and asks what the heck has been going on, Hermione, of all people, lies to Professor McGonagall. And Harry and Ron can't believe it at all. And their actions are rewarded yet again. But the rewards go a little bit deeper than that. Because, as Rowling writes, from that moment on, Hermione Granger became their friend. There are some things that you can't share without ending up liking each other. And knocking out a 12-foot troll, a 12-foot mountain troll, is one of them. It was really interesting in Rowling's, writing, that she draws upon this idea that there are some things that you can't share without ending up liking each other. Well, obviously, that's in reference to Hermione lying to protect Harry and Ron and not tell the truth, because that's so atypical of her character. But it's a very Gryffindor thing to do, to be brave. She's brave enough to break the rules. That's why she's a Gryffindor and not an intellectual Ravenclaw. This is the proving point for why Hermione is in Ravenclaw. She's incredibly brave, incredibly brave. And this shows that through this. And so it's really interesting that Rowling makes, her own joke with all of this and, you know, undercutting the issue that it's knocking out a 12-foot mountain troll that brought them together. It's not. It's Hermione lying, and the fact that Ron and Harry came to protect her or save her by getting her back to the common room. It's such a good book. It's such a good book. So yeah, all right. So we're gonna have a little bit of fun now. We're gonna move into some other things and just some things that I want to point out to you guys, because as we have already discussed, there is all kinds of interesting things when it comes to the names of these characters. We've already talked about Harry's name, a little bit of Harry's name, his last name in particular. We've talked about Dumbledore's name, and we have also talked about Voldemort's name, or Voldemort, as Rowling originally intended for it to be pronounced. But we're going to look at some other things and look at some other names. So you guys do not have to know these names right now. However, you will need to know them for the final test that we take on the book. You won't have to know all of them, but you'll need to know some of them at least, and be able to match meanings and that kind of thing, or just explain why they're so important. But before we get into that, just some things that I want to point out. So the character names themselves are incredibly important, and they're often filled with these insane levels of meaning. Like, once I was looking into some of the stuff, I found out things today, or as I was preparing for this, that I never even realized. I'm like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that that's what that person's name meant, which is amazing, because it just makes it that much more interesting. But these insane levels of meaning, they're insane because they reveal aspects of the character, and often aspects of the character that you would never even realize, but Rowling realizes it and Rowling knows. So oftentimes these things are more for her. But as we look into these things and we discover what's going on with these characters, we really start to realize that, like, Rowling has an incredible amount of brilliance, an incredible amount of craft and thought that she puts into all of these characters, and like in just their names, because she builds the characters, of course, but their name is just so important to who they are. And of course, this kind of brilliance and this craft and this adherence to building this whole world, you know, it affects how we, or it contributes to that effect that we feel when we're in the wizarding world, even if we don't realize it. Because sometimes you're just kind of like, oh, well, like, obviously, like, that makes sense because that character, that's completely in line with who they are, what they do. And some of them are more obvious than others, but a lot of these with their like Latin and French roots and some other stuff, you may not notice it, but sometimes they're more evident than they are. So we're just going to jump in and we're going to look at some of these characters and see who they are on a more deeper level. And a lot of the, well, actually, so as we run through these next slides, there are a lot of, I chose to use illustrations rather than the actors who portrayed them in the films, to just give you some more stuff on them, because you guys have seen, most of you guys have seen the films, you know what the actors look like. And to me, looking at the illustrations just builds to the more fantasy of it, because if I'm looking at a real person, I know it's a movie and it's not real, but somehow looking at an illustration makes it more fantastical for me, and I really enjoy that. And so the illustrations, or at least most of these, are from the new illustrated versions of the books as done by illustrator Jim Kay, and they are brilliant. So moving on. Oh, look, it's Hogwarts, isn't it lovely? Okay, so moving on, of course, where else would we start except with our protagonist and hero, Harry James Potter. Now, of course, we haven't looked at this yet, but Harry is actually the Middle English form of the name Henry. And if you know your English history well enough, you know that there were a grand total of 8 kings who were named Henry, and the name itself was even tied to the idea of being a king or being a leader. Now, of course, Rowling isn't saying that Harry is the king of the wizards by any means, but he has kingly qualities because of his leadership potential and because of who he is. And of course, with the name Potter, we have already discussed how Potter refers to the Potter's Field, which is not only where Judas was buried in after his, suicide in the scripture, but also this is where people would be buried if they were foreigners in a land where no one knew who they were. And so they would just be put in the potter's field, and that would be their grave. And it may not have a last name or a name of where they were from on the grave, but the people who they didn't know who they were buried in the potter's field. Harry has no idea who he is. He doesn't know who his parents are. He doesn't know who he is. He is that lost child. So even that universal theme of the lost child growing up to find himself is tied to Harry's own name. She's brilliant, 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 brilliant. Or she's just adhering to, the universal themes that are always there. But it's brilliant nonetheless. And of course, James is of course a reference to his father's name, and that's that. So there's Harry. And I picked this picture in particular because this does show how he is separated from the people he lives with, and that's the cupboard under the stairs. There's spiders, of course, and he doesn't have the best living conditions, and he's really not a part of the family where he lives, and he's very different, and he knows that. And so Harry Potter, a leader who doesn't have a family. Moving on, I'm going to put myself in the corner down here to not be in the way. Next, we move on to our next best character, Ronald Bilious Weasley. And so Ronald is actually the Norse name Ronvold, I'm guessing. I don't actually know how to say that. But the basis is that this name meant having the god's power, but not necessarily the god himself. So Ron's first name means that he is an advisor to the king. He's an advisor to the leader. He is the second. And this idea of second definitely plays into Ron's family, because Ron has never been seen as the best or the brightest in his family because, well, Ron's just Ron. He's not really an intellectual standout like Percy. He's not doing anything cool like Charlie with the dragons. And, he's not a cut up like Fred and George. And he's not the baby like Jenny, who receives most of the attention, which you guys don't even know Jenny yet, but she'll come up later in the second book. But Ronald is second, which is really interesting. And now his middle name, which he's named after his uncle. Well, going back, before I do that, sorry. He's second to Harry, and he's second in life. He's always wanted something more for himself other than to just be in second place to his family, second place to his friends. And this whole being best friends with the boy who lived thing doesn't really make this problem any better. It actually worsens it. But of course, second. That is the nature of Ron's character. That's the nature of his name. He is second. Of course, Bilious, being named after his uncle, is basically associated with the root word being bile, which, if you guys have studied this in science class or history class, at some point was one of the 4 humors according to medieval science. And the humors were like these 4 things that determine mood and just the personality, and it was very primitive personality and emotion type theory stuff. But bile was the one that was associated with regulating anger and jealousy, which again relates to the whole second idea of Ron's name and Ron's character. And of course, his last name Weasley is just based on the word weasel. And this is just part of Rowling's own humor. And she's such a quirky person when it comes to her explanations. But Rowling felt that the bad reputation of weasels was undeserved, because weasels are just kids that are just creatures that just burrow and they, make a mess and they dig through garbage. But they're a really cute and, a very familial kind of species, and they just get they have a really bad reputation from humans, which kind of plays into that whole pureblood thing that we talked about, or that I mentioned earlier, with how the Weasleys are very different from the other pureblood families. But it's also really interesting because, of course, the Weasleys, their home is called the Burrow. Anyway, there's Ron, as illustrated by Jim Kay. And I think I love Kay's illustration because I think that's a more accurate representation than Rupert Grint in the films, because Rupert didn't have enough freckles and his hair wasn't red enough. But anyway, all right, there's good old Hermione Granger. So Hermione is a name that originated from Greek mythology. Hermione is actually the daughter of King Menelaus. For those of you who know your Greek myth, I'm not going to go into who Menelaus is. And then Shakespeare also used the name from Greek myths for one of his main characters in A Winter's Tale, which is one of his lesser known plays, but it's a really good one. Also has one of the most obscure stage directions in it, Exit Pursued by a Bear. I don't know how they did that in medieval times, or Elizabethan times, but they did it. So anyway, but the interesting thing is Hermione is nothing like either one of those characters. But Rowling chose the name on the basis of wanting an original name that would prove a pair of dentists' cleverness. Because Hermione's parents are both muggles and they're both dentists. And so because of that, she just wanted to show how like how two really scholarly muggles and well-learned muggles could choose a really, special, scholarly, high academic name for a high academic child. And also, Rowling didn't want, in the event that the book became really popular, she didn't want to pick a common name, especially if girls were like Hermione and received derision for being just like, the character that she is. She cared about her future audience and did that as a result by picking something really random yet really specific at the same time. And then Granger is an Old English word for bailiff. And of course, a bailiff is someone who in a court of law would keep order and make sure that everyone was following the rules. And that is exactly what Hermione does for the boys, except when she doesn't and reveals her true nature. All right, moving on. We find our first Slytherin character, Draco Malfoy. Now, of course, you probably heard the word Draco before. It's also in the Hogwarts motto, Draco Dormiens Nunquam Titilandus, which means never tickle a sleeping dragon. Very practical advice for a school, not something like onward and upward or, perseverance and truth or, education for a higher purpose. Nothing against our school by any means, but, they're very lofty aspirations. But it's really interesting that in the quirkiness of Hogwarts and the quirkiness of the world that the school motto is never tickle a sleeping dragon. Very practical. So of course Draco means dragon in Latin, probably due to the fact that he is a Slytherin and that's their house animal. Part of their house crest is a serpent. It's a snake. So a dragon is is a bigger snake, and so his name means dragon. Maybe due to his temperament. Not exactly sure what that's supposed to be tied to. Maybe just due to his Slytherin nature. And of course, Malfoy is a combination of two words, in which mal is French for bad, and then foy also means faith or trust. So bad faith, bad trust, trusting in something bad, having faith in something bad, could be in reference to his pureblood ancestry and how he thinks that makes him better. Could be in reference to the more darker designs of his family that are revealed in later books in the series. So dragon with bad trust, or bad trust in the dragon, maybe. I don't know, maybe the dragon is someone, or maybe it's just him. I'm not sure. All right, now let's move on to some staff members. And we'll start at the bottom of the barrel. So this is not a Jim Kay illustration because he hasn't done Filch yet, or at least he hasn't done a full image of Filch yet, but that is Argus Filch. And Argus was the mythological monster with 100 eyes who was Hera, wife of Zeus, who was Hera's watchman. Now, at some point in the story, in that mythological story, Hermes actually tricked, or I think it was Hermes actually tricked Argus and had all of his eyes closed because he would sleep with 50 eyes open and 50 eyes shut. But if all of his eyes shut, he would die. And so all of his eyes were shut. And of course, Hera took the eyes and then put them on the feathers of the peacock, and that's why the peacock looks that way, and it looks like it has eyes on its feathers. The Greeks had an answer for everything. But anyway, I think it refers to how he always keeps a watchful eye on everything, and even has, help through his cat, Mrs. Norris, because it's even said in the book somewhere that if, someone was breaking a rule and Mrs. Norris was nearby, she would run off to Argus and, tell him, and he'd come running to get the kids to follow the rules. And then, of course, Filch is a British word that means to steal. And we don't really see Filch stealing anything from kids. Maybe he steals their joy. Maybe he steals their fun, but he has stolen quite a few things from the Weasley twins over the years. Later on in the books, there's a whole cabinet just full of all the things he's confiscated from the Weasleys. So maybe that has something to do with his character as well. Next up, we have Rubeus Hagrid, Hogwarts gamekeeper and keeper of the keys. And of course, his name has a lot to do with his own character, like all of these names do. Rubeus means the red. This is actually a contrast to Dumbledore's the white, and Rowling even planned it that way on purpose because Rubeus is very red in the face. He always has, a cheery disposition, very Santa Claus-like rosy cheek kind of thing. But the redness could also be caused because he has a very haggard. You weren't too far off, Addie, when you wrote haggard instead of Hagrid, because it's actually the word that Rowling based it off of is a hag, or being hag-ridden, which is a more British slang term, which has to do with him being a drunkard, because Hagrid drinks quite a lot. It's one of his favorite pastimes, and it's part of the reason why he's always red in the face as well. But there's some deeper backstory to Hagrid and why he does that. That's revealed later. I know I keep saying that, but it's just because this whole series is so tied together in such a intertwined fashion that's just kind of how that works, is that this is the exposition to the greater story. And it has its own exposition, of course, but it is the exposition to the greater story, and it's just a setup for everything else that follows, and it's brilliant in how it does that. So read the other books. Professor Minerva McGonagall, my favorite Hogwarts professor. Minerva McGonagall, Transfiguration Professor, head of Gryffindor House, and the deputy headmistress of Hogwarts. And of course, Minerva is the Roman goddess of wisdom. This was Athena before she became Minerva when the Romans took over and changed stuff and made things a little bit differently. She's a Roman goddess of wisdom because McGonagall is very smart. But again, like Hermione, her bravery and courage outweighed her intellectual side and her smartness, which is why she was Gryffindor when she was a student, and part of the reason why she is head of Gryffindor House. But she's also very crafty. She knows how to manipulate these rules to get what she wants, and as it's seen when she names or makes Harry the Seeker for the house team, so she doesn't have to, deal with with Snape being all high and mighty. She finds a way around some rules, and she's very crafty in the way she does it. Now, again, this is part of Rowling's quirkiness in naming characters. McGonagall is actually taken from England's worst poet. There's a link there that you guys could check out if you want to, but it just explains who the original McGonagall was. And so Rowling thought it was really funny that Minerva could possibly be related to someone who was known for being just so awful and stupid and the worst poet ever, and that would be a point of something that she wouldn't want to talk about and something that she would want to distance herself from so that she could be better, which is very much in character with her own character. But it's kind of funny that Rowling didn't pick a word to illustrate that, but she did pick a name that was tied to something that British people would have been familiar with. Kind of hilarious that she does something like that. But yeah, click on that link if you want to check that out. It's a rather long article, but it would at least tell you who the original McGonagall was. And there's some excerpts of his really poor poetry as well. Moving on, Professor Filius Flitwick, Charms Master and head of Ravenclaw House. This is the professor who was teaching them the Wingardium Leviosa charm. This is not a Jim Kay illustration, but it is something that I thought captured the character well. So Filius is Latin for filial, which means son or daughter of. But Flitwick, things get a little more interesting. So we're actually going to click on this and open this in a new tab so I can show you what's actually going on there. So this is from the Wizarding World stuff. There's Professor Flitwick as he appears in the Sorcerer's Stone movie. So we'll scroll down here. So looking at this right here. So fun fact, Flitwick happens to be a town in Bedfordshire, which was once a dairy farm beside the river Flit. The name is derived from the Old English words fliot, meaning river, and wick, meaning dairy farm. It seems a little odd to think of a charms professor as the son of a river dairy farm, so perhaps it's worth digging just a little deeper. If you look at the words flit and wick individually, then it starts to make sense. A lot of the spells that we see Professor Flitwick perform require an adept flick of the wand, and the first part of his name means just that, to flutter, or a light, swift movement. It comes from the Middle English word flitten, which translates to fly. And what is the first spell that Professor Flitwick teaches the class? Nothing other than Wingardium Leviosa, the spell to make things soar through the air. So here we have the son of movement, which is an accurate description of a very talented, charmed professor, wouldn't you say? Isn't that awesome? That's just really cool that like it's tied to what he actually does, like most of these. So anyway, all right, moving on. Professor Pomona Sprout, herbology professor and the head of Hufflepuff House. So Pomona is actually from the Latin pomum, meaning fruit, and it's also the name of that same Roman goddess, Pomona, who was the goddess of fruit and the protector of orchards. And then, of course, her last name, Sprout, well, obviously, she takes care of plants. She has an aptitude for plants and stuff. But it's also tied to how she notices on some of her students and really cares for some of her students in a way, because later on she develops a really fascinating relationship, a very nurturing relationship with Neville Longbottom, and begins to, stroke his aptitude for taking care of magical herbs and plants, and curating them and doing that kind of thing. And so she sprouts curiosity, she sprouts ingenuity. She has a sprouting effect on other people and really nurtures them as a gardener would nurture plants. And that's really sweet of her character to do something like that. Okay, moving on to Professor Severus Snape. So, potions master and head of Slytherin House. Severus means severe or strict, but there are also plenty of canonized saints within the Catholic faith that also have this name as well. Snape also means to be hard upon, rebuke, or snub, and it is taken from the Old Norse snepa, which means to outrage, dishonor, or disgrace. For those of you that know things, this version, the Old Norse, is tied to his time at Hogwarts, and the modern day meaning is tied to how he treats people. So it's interesting that the old world meaning refers to an older time in Snape's life, but the newer meaning, the English meaning, means how he treats people in everyday life. I don't know if that's intentional on Rowling's part, but knowing how she thinks, it probably is. All right, I'm moving on to the best and the greatest wizard of all time, Professor Albus Wulfric Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, Order of Merlin, First Class, Headmaster of Hogwarts. Oh, it's a mouthful, isn't it? But, of course, Albus means white, maybe for his age, for his purity, for his goodness, of being just a great wizard of the light side. Not to get into Star Wars stuff, but, that whole, like, light and darkness, there's a light side, and there's a good side in every battle, and there's a dark side in every battle. And Albus is the picture of the good side, is the greatest wizard of his time. Percival is related to a knight. That's one of the knights of the King Arthur legends. And so there's more meaning to his name that I'm not going to go into right now. But it's just know that it's a knight because he is a warrior, and a very light side warrior as well. Now, Wulfric is an older name, but the first part of that name, Wolf, should sound very familiar and should look very familiar to something else that you have read. And to just introduce something that, again, that ties to some later things in the novel or in the entire series. If you know Dumbledore's nemesis and the precursor to Voldemort, how about you try saying his old enemy's name with special focus on the first part of that character's name? So for those of you that don't know, I'll just let that sit. Fascinating that Rowling has tied part of their names together in that very interesting, intricate way in being based on something so long ago. Of course, Brian is a Celtic word that means noble, but it's also a really normal name. Rowling thought it would be quirky to have, you know, these great names like Alvis, Percival, Wulfric, Brian, Dumbledore. You know, like it's just kind of funny, but it still flows. It is beautiful. It's such a great name, and it's just big and proud and noble. And his name is noble, but it's also Brian, which is just an everyday common name and a very Muggle name at that. But Dumbledore is a half-blood wizard. Not that it matters, but he is a half-blood wizard, and so that's part of his Muggle roots, I guess. And of course, Dumbledore is an archaic word for Bumblebee because he's always humming something because he has such an affinity for music, and it's also just part of his quirky nature. Whew, okay, that was a lot of names. All right, so of course, know the professors' names. Special focus on Harry, Ron, and Hermione, and then probably some focus on Dumbledore and McGonagall, and the others are for fun. Snape is also really important as well, but the others are just thrown there for fun, just so I could show you guys how brilliant Rowling is and how much time she takes to actually create these characters and give them very specific names on everything. All right, so moving ahead, preparing for your quiz that you need to take after doing all of this. So it's just going to be based on comprehension of the reading. So there's things that were mentioned here. The names are not going to be on there. Those are for later, but it's just going to be based on the comprehension. I'm not going to ask you big world stuff about the universal theme of children's lit. You may need to know that just a little bit, but there's not going to be like a big question about it. I'm not going to ask you to like trace the theme or anything like that. But it's just really going to be ultimately based on the comprehension of the reading. You just need to be able to recall characters and events from these 4 chapters. There are 11 multiple choice questions, trying to keep this easy on you guys while we're doing online learning stuff. And then there are 4 short answer questions, although 3 of the answers were included in these slides and this presentation and were given quite a significant time in looking at, so you guys should be able to answer those no problem. But then there's also, I don't typically do this, but there's also, and let you know what the bonus question is going to be about, but there's a bonus question about Quidditch. So I would review everything there is to know about Quidditch as Oliver Wood explains it to Harry, and then go from there. Okay, that is from a previous thing. I think that's the slides that I made all this out of, but anyway, don't pay attention to that. Okay, so let me bring myself back to full screen. Okay, here we are. Yay. All right, so a couple of hitches in that presentation, but that's okay. So hope you guys enjoyed that. After this, just make sure again that you turn in your homework, that you share it with me by midnight tonight so I don't count you late and don't have to put a 0 in for everything. I apologize for the length of this video. I don't even know how long I've been talking. I wish I was there with you guys so we could actually do this and it wouldn't just be me talking to you. But continue reading the book. If you have any questions about your essay, if you're getting some struggles there, I'll be available to you all day. And remember, Thursday as well, tomorrow, 2 to 4. That's when you guys can talk to me. That's when you guys can do stuff. That's when we can get on a Google Hangout call and just talk to each other and talk through some papers and stuff. If you want to go ahead and send your essay to me and get some initial feedback on it as you're drafting, that's fine too. I'll go ahead and do that. But otherwise, just know that I miss you guys, and I'm definitely praying for all of you by name. And yeah, I'm ready to be back in school, and we still got 3.5 more weeks of this, and maybe even more after that. But anyway, okay. I love you guys. I'm going to shut up. I apologize for how long this video is. There's only going to be one of these a week. But anyway, all right. I'm going to shut up. Love you guys. Bye.